Nelson Mandela Foundation has partnered with the South African Human Rights Commission on a new podcast reflecting on the 2021 July Unrest. Now, the podcast seeks to archive the stories and analysis of the events that took place in parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng in 7 days. For more on this, we're joined by Nelson Mandela Foundation Research Manager Kneo Mokgopa. Thank you for joining us, Kneo. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for...
In fact, it is afternoon. I apologize. Tell me more about this podcast. What's the idea behind it?
Sure. So we wanted, as you're describing, really, to archive these stories and to make them publicly available. What we realized was that in the conversations and the discourse around July 2021, there were so many different framings. So on the one hand, initially the very big framing was around Jacob Zuma, former President Jacob Zuma, and we referred to it as the Zuma Unrest, and then the Zuma Insurrection, and then we moved to the unrest, to riots and otherwise. And so we thought by putting a podcast together, we could really give this moment its due in its contribution to modern South African history, and that the public and publics more generally would have access to it to shape our ongoing politics.
What kind of stories can we expect from the podcast? Are you talking to the victims? Are you talking to the key players in the security apparatus? How is it set up?
So the podcast is set up almost in like a documentary style, so it isn't necessarily episodic in that way. And the people that we speak to, it's quite a wide range of people. So we speak to people who were directly affected, such as we went to KZN in Durban, and we spoke to people around South Beach. We went to Umlazi. We spoke to professors and thought leaders like Dr. Bongani Buthelezi. So it's a mix between people describing their own experiences and speaking truth to power, but then it's also then the analysis and trying to make sense, looking at the history of the region, looking at the history of former President Jacob Zuma, to kind of collectively together make sense of this moment.
Yes, and then what have been your reflections? So when you descend upon KwaZulu-Natal and you speak to the victims, I had two guests just before this conversation who focused on the aspect of security and how when you look at even our security apparatus, not so much has changed. So we could possibly still be exposed to experiencing something so tragic and not having effective response from our security apparatus, but also the conditions on the ground, the socio-economic challenges that you could argue were partly, I suppose, the drivers of the riots that we saw. What were your reflections when you were in the communities about what's changed and what hasn't changed?
I think that talking to different people about the unrest, I felt mad, if I'm being honest. I felt very, very mad and disappointed. The report from that expert panel into the unrest, near the end of it, it makes it quite clear. It says that a lot of the responsibility for this moment lies with the cabinet. And I think that when you compound it and looking at some of the, what's the word now, underlying conditions like you're describing, again there you're seeing significant political failures, the same kinds of political failures that have resulted in the energy crisis that we're facing. It's not a money problem, it's not a tech problem, and otherwise it's not a coal problem, you know. And so the sense of betrayal, the sense of how could this be allowed to have happened, you know, and again, coming back to that report from that expert panel, how they're describing how a big driver of it was these political factions within the African National Congress. So we're paying the price for these political factions vying for power at the scale that we saw it at. I felt disappointed, I felt hurt, I felt mad, and I think I still do, given that the conditions that led to the unrest, the extreme levels of inequality and poverty, are still present. So it's not about if it's going to happen again, it's a matter of time.
Yeah, and the question is, are we ready to respond effectively, God forbid, should it happen? Talk to me about the importance of archiving these stories. Often in this country, what I've observed is that we get shocked about certain things and we easily move on. Whether it's gender-based violence, you know, we wait for someone to be brutally violated, and then we are angry about it, and then we swiftly move on. Hammanskraal, people are dying because of drinking water that is possibly not clean, and then we move on. 47 or over 30 are dead. Why is it important to archive these stories for you as the Nelson Mandela Foundation?
Listen, I think exactly as you're describing, you know, This country has faced so many ruptures. Marikana was a rupture. Life Esidimeni was a rupture. And the way that the state, and I'm going to say power more generally, has been responding to our feelings, really, our feelings of betrayal, that something like this could have happened. Actually, my boss, Vern Harris, wrote an article really critiquing commissions of inquiry and how not only is it a thing that we've been doing in this country since the TRC, but colonial governments during colonial times in South Africa, they also used commissions of inquiry, and the purpose of it was to quell discontent. It's not designed to achieve structural change. It isn't a court. It doesn't have those similar kinds of power. And so we're seeing constantly then these commissions of inquiry put out and quelling the fires and putting out the smoke. And so we thought that by archiving these stories, archiving the fact that July 2021 happened, the South African unrest happened, and this is what it means and this is why it happened, is important for future generations, especially because I think it's quite known that we're looking for freedom. We're looking for different tools and measures and means of creating freedom in this country. And a podcast like this, we feel that could significantly contribute to the ideologies, the thinking, and the construction then of a new path to freedom.
Yeah. Why the decision to partner with the South African Human Rights Commission? What do they bring?
I think so. The Commission has been doing a lot of work in terms of peace building and repairing the relationships in communities. Actually, we had initially worked together on such work in peace building and these workshops, especially around the incidents that happened in Phoenix and otherwise. And so the work that they're doing, and especially in the report that they're going to come out with, I think later this month, at the end of this month, reflecting on the hearings that they had with victims and people who were affected, we thought that it would align very, very nicely. But also, moreover, the idea of human rights, at least historically, have been the most powerful tool that general lay people, the public, have against power. It's the one thing that we can say, no, this is where you're crossing a line. And so in thinking about a partner, the Commission really stood out in terms of the work that they're doing currently in building communities back together, but also in the sense of human rights and how the podcast unfolds.
Okay, so Wapupa Umhlaba is the name of the podcast. Is it being released today?
It has been released today. We released the prologue today, and it's out on Google and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere else people stream their podcasts.
All right, Kneo Mokgopa, thank you so much for joining us to talk to us about this incredible podcast. That's the Nelson Mandela Foundation Research Manager.